Wonderful. Well, thanks as always to Arts Front for their incredible support of this this initiative. I'd like to formally welcome everybody, and I am coming to you from Wongal land in the Eora Nation, part of Sydney, and pay my deep respects to elders past, present, and those yet to come, particularly in this week of NAIDOC week. And I want to shout from the rooftops, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And so if you could just put in the chat where you're coming to us from and respect to country, that would be fantastic. I'm just going to hand over to Görkem for some housekeeping.
Hi everyone, I'm zooming in from the unceded land of the Dja Dja Wurrung, and I'd also like to pay my deep respects to elders and community. With the housekeeping, just to let you know that the session is being recorded, and it will be put up on the Arts Front page after the session, and it's also being live streamed to YouTube. We would ask that you keep your mics on mute until there is discussion or question time. And also, when we go into breakouts, which will be a bit later on in the session, if you require captioning, please could you put that in the chat now so that we can assign you to the appropriate room. And otherwise, enjoy the session. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Görkem. So what we wanted to do, and this is all part of the experiment of this space, but also it seems highly appropriate given that it is NAIDOC week, was we just wanted to do a little bit of recap and revisit the conversation we had last week. If you weren't with us, don't worry. We are just going to pick out one of the kind of key messages that came from both Tyson Yunkaporta and Pauline Lampton, which was about connection to place. And just to explore from our own perspectives what it might mean if we were to really root our practice and our work much more in place. And obviously COVID has given us a really strong taste of what that might feel and look like. So to kick that off, I thought, and we're going to stay in a group and we'd really value your contributions either in the chat or stick up your hand, use the reaction buttons. We'll keep our eyes out for that. But to kick us off, I'm just going to ask Görkem what experience you have of arts projects that are really connected to place.
Yeah, I guess when I was thinking about it, I was thinking about a project that we worked on in 2014, 2015 called the 24-Hour Experience. And that project was a large-scale project. The first one was part of the Live Arts Festival in Melbourne, and it was in the Melbourne CBD. And it was, I described it as a living documentary of place, the lesser heard perspectives of place. And the project engaged about 100 artists, 150 community members, 24 different locations around Melbourne, and the audience moved from site to site over the 24 hours. So every hour there was a new work in a different location. And the locations were really varied. We even used the Forensics Institute. We were in, gallery spaces, Federation Square, down by the river. We were in indoors, outdoors, in public toilets in Burke Street. So it was basically across the whole city. And it really was a work about place. It was about the actual physical locations, but also the perspectives of the people that inhabit those spaces. We then did another version of it in Ballarat, which was similarly the same concept, but basically engaging with people from Ballarat, and we moved across 24 different locations there. So I guess that was, the one that I really thought about when I thought about working in place. And I think there's great value, like there was amazing value from both from the artists, the community, and also the audiences that shared that work. I wanted to ask you, Pippa, about your work with Change Fest. You've been working on systems change in that space, haven't you? Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So Change Fest is a national celebration of place-based social change. So it's very much work that's happening in the social services space. And coming from the arts, I moved and directed and produced the first one last year. It was a real eye-opener to me in terms of a much more integrated approach to empowering community and then working through layers of government to reimagine how services might be delivered to local communities. And it felt to me that the arts could really could really benefit from a bit more connection into that work. We are very committed to working alongside and taking direction from Indigenous people. And in that space, it's interesting because, in fact, culturally, I feel that the development of Indigenous organisations and so on is also really leading in that space. So there's kind of great reciprocity between the two sectors in terms of what can possibly happen. It made me reflect in terms of myself, and COVID has really helped this, that actually I don't connect to my place, the place where I live particularly, I don't connect enough. And what would it look like to be making work very specifically for my local community? Because I live in a city, it's quite easy to then go to the big cultural centres and not think about place in quite the same way. So I guess I was really prompted by Tyrone and Pauline's provocation to, okay, yeah, what does that really look like to be connecting more? I'm interested in if other people have thoughts about work in place and what that might mean to you. Has anyone got any?
I can see that there's a couple of people on the call that I'd love to call on if you're happy to contribute your thoughts to this conversation. Liz, I can see you smiling. Have you got any thoughts or anything that you've worked on that's really, grounded in place?
Yeah, so I do a lot of work within arts, health and healing, and that's associated directly with place. And it's about having that deep connection and understanding from an Indigenous standpoint what place represents. And it's difficult to describe, yet when you look at migrants coming to Australia, they have a great disconnection with what place is, and that stems from not knowing the Indigenous stories of the past. So those narratives of the past are so important because they build a sense of belongingness towards others, and you can see that in when you look at a certain place and the name of a place, for example. If it's an Indigenous name, then it comes with a storyline, and the storyline relates to this, to the actual events. It describes the animals, the plants, the seasons, everything. It's got all those knowledges in it. And unfortunately, there are not many Indigenous named places, and that's sad to see because it's so informative for others. So when I paint, I love to paint on my country. It's a connection I have.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And it's something I've also reflected on when you're talking about past and histories and stories. Also, one that we often do forget is Australia's colonial history and story, and that's part of the narrative as well, and important for us to remember. Alex, I wanted to ask you. I know that you've got a project in your local area that you're going to be working on a quarry. Is that right? Did you have any thoughts on working in place you wanted to share with us?
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I meant Alex Harrison. I'm so sorry. There's two Alexes here, but then I'd love to hear from you, Alex Travis. Sorry.
No worries, thank you. Let's go with Alex Travis and give me a moment to gather my thoughts.
No worries. Alex Travis, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was a bit, I'm glad that you weren't referring to me because I thought, are we doing a work with a quarry that I don't know about? So yeah, I mean, the closest to that, we do have a work that is a site-specific work that operates along the, it's called Against the Tide, and is a site-specific work which operates, is an audio experience from the Parramatta River through to Circular Quay, and is a collaboration with elders and community members to tell the stories of the river. And so we have been working in that space for a little while, but I'm here today representing the Think and Do Tank Foundation and the work that we do at Lost in Books, which is a multilingual bookshop operating out of Fairfield. And we're a community hub that runs a whole bunch of creative programs with refugees and migrants.
Thanks, Alex.
Can I just make a big shout out to the Against the Tide project? I've had the privilege of being able to listen to it, and it's absolutely extraordinary in terms of its multi-layeredness. So I really hope that's seeing the light of day, Alex, because it's an amazing piece of work.
Thank you. Thanks, Pippa.
Bron Batten, did you have anything you wanted to add to the conversation? No.
Yay!
Probably the couple of things spring to mind. Working in outdoor festival spaces, so on country. I spent many years as the programmer for the Falls Festival in Lorne, which happens in the National Forest down there. So yeah, thinking about ways that that festival environment directly relates to the weather and the environment, and it's so responsive to those conditions. So, but I think that reflecting on my time there could have engaged more with the Indigenous history of that place and acknowledged sort of the country more. So yeah, just thinking about that, but also a specific project called The Hole, which is what it says it is, which is a durational piece where we dig a hole over 3 days and then we fill it in again. And we did that. The last two presentations have been overseas and in Berlin and Prague. And I'm again thinking about if we brought it back here, what kind of engagement we might have with country in a different way if it was restaged in Australia. So yeah, they're the couple of thoughts I had.
Thanks, Bron. Thank you. And Pippa's just asked, how can we do more to engage our audiences on this country? Did you want to talk more about that, Pippa?
I guess I've heard a lot of stories in this NAIDOC week, some of them not so great in terms of an elder started on Monday Auntie Yvonne was talking about the fact that it's still very difficult for people to acknowledge Aboriginal custodianship of the land, and how can we, it just seems to me that's a link that is worth making. I don't know that I have great solutions, but I think the more cognizant we are and the more respectful we are, and then that becomes kind of, that seeps in, certainly in terms of kids. I know that many schools now, not all, but many. And so, yeah, I'm just interested in that whole question about how we bring audiences on the journey.
Yeah, does anyone have any thoughts on that? I can see Deborah Batten. Did you have any thoughts about that question? You don't have to, just if you did.
Tricky, isn't it?
Hang on.
Oh, you're in the same place.
I'm on echo. Hope you're enjoying that echo. Look, I feel like the experience is when you get audiences there, they engage. It's how to get them there and become interest, which, it's one of our perpetual problems in the arts, isn't it? That we know that people, once they're there, they're happy to be there, and they have an experience that they usually find either challenging or positive or interesting. But the whole thing of how we get them to the projects is still, we're still caught in a bubble where we seem to get the same people interested. And I wish I had solutions to that, Görkem.
Yes.
I'll chip in there. I had I don't know if people have come across Anna Treglone's The Impossible Project, which is a beautiful project capturing it had started before COVID, but she's reignited it to capture so many of the projects that have been lost or postponed due to the coronavirus. And I got engaged in a conversation with her about a trip that I was supposed to take to Tromsø that I never took. And so I'd written a whole piece about it. And through that conversation, I started to imagine this, because I was, instead of going to Tromsø, I was walking around the block a lot under lockdown. And so I started to imagine this block that I live on, it's a triangular block, as an island. And I started reaching out to neighbours, and I'm developing a project with the neighbours about the island block that I live on. So I also am really excited and interested in in that localised conversation, how we might totally rethink how we make these projects so that people are in there from the very beginning.
Thanks, Pippa. We've just got a couple more minutes before we're going to move to this week's conversation. Did anyone have anything they wanted to add, or even just questions or thoughts around these topics of place and engagement of country and audiences? Just chime in, or you can put it in the chat as well. We're happy to read out comments if you don't actually want to talk. That's also fine. Nope, we've come to the end of the conversation. George, unless George, you put in a beautiful acknowledgement in the chat. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Sorry, I chimed in late and was focusing on other things. I'm not quite sure what the conversation we're in. I think I know what we're talking about. But I guess, I think someone was talking before about the connecting people to the land in the same way the land connects to itself. You know, the rivers connect to the mountains, connect to the thing. And I guess in a way to think of, to start reimagining the world as a whole, not just, and sort of undoing the smaller puzzles that capitalism tends to get us thinking in, you know, where we're breaking things down into smaller problems to solve, and just sort of like maybe think about reversing that and looking at the world as finding ways to look to look at the world as a whole again.
That is
beautiful.
A segue to what we're about to do next. Görkem.
Thanks, George. So thank you everyone for that. We really love that you know, people are joining these sessions, and we'd love it to be as collaborative as possible. So it's really lovely to hear everyone's thoughts and questions and comments. Today we're going to have an interview with Jessica Whyte, Associate Professor of Philosophy in the School of Humanities and Languages at the University of New South Wales. Her work integrates political philosophy, intellectual history, and political economy to analyse contemporary forms of sovereignty, human rights, humanitarianism, and militarism. Her most recent book, The Morals of the Market, Human Rights and the Rise of Neoliberalism, was published in 2019, and she draws on detailed archival research on the parallel histories of human rights and neoliberalism. So The Morals of the Market, it basically uncovers the place of human rights in neoliberal attempts to develop a moral framework for a market society. In my interview with Jessica, I focus on unpacking a brief history of neoliberalism to help us understand this moral philosophy better. As you listen to the interview, it would be wonderful if you could jot down any thoughts that you have, questions about how this way of thinking impacts the arts. As Pippa and I are going to open up the discussion afterwards to have a chat about that, how neoliberalism impacts the arts. So we hope you enjoy the interview, and we'll be back here chatting as soon as it's done. Thank you. Jessica, I came across your book, The Morals of the Market and the Rise of Neoliberalism, when you were being interviewed about it on Radio National. At the time, I'd been thinking about neoliberalism and how its values have infiltrated every aspect of our human relationships, and how in the arts we are constantly battling with this ideology without really understanding what it is. In fact, speaking with family and friends, I realised that we've been trained to see anyone who utters the words neoliberalism as a radical old guard communist. But when I ask people seriously, what do you understand by the term? It becomes apparent that they actually feel quite intimidated by the word. Mostly, I think we don't understand what it means. Usually people say something about capitalism. So I thought perhaps that it's the ingenuity of this ideology. Either way, I think it's quite scary though. As one documentary I saw pointed out, not understanding this system would be like a person in the former Soviet Union not knowing what communism is. And what was completely eye-opening to me about your book is that neoliberalism is not an economic theory, it's a value system with its own set of morals and beliefs. So I wondered if you could give us a bit of an origin story to help us understand neoliberalism a little better.
Yes, sure. I'm happy to. I think what you say is really right about it's a term that's thrown around a lot, but often without all that much precision. And often people tend to think of it as this strictly economic idea. It's about converting all values into economic value. And what I suggest in my book is that this is a really incomplete understanding. So in terms of the origins, I go back in particular to 1947, which is when Friedrich Hayek founded the neoliberal Mont Pelerin Society. And he founded this society in an attempt to revive liberalism internationally in a period in which it was very much perceived, certainly by him and the people he brought together, to be under threat, and to be under threat not just from communism and the Soviet Union, but in particular from the rise of the welfare state in the UK, the rise of the New Deal, the rise of socialism, social democracy, planning, and increasingly from anti-colonial nationalism and third worldism in the colonies. And so one of the really important things I think about this society, the Mont Pelerin Society, is that Hayek brought together a bunch of figures who were from a whole range of different disciplines. So there was certainly a bunch of economists, people in particular from the Chicago School of Economics, but there were also philosophers, there were historians, there were people from various fields. And what united them was this idea that, in the words of the founding document, that the central values of civilization are in danger. And so they really went about trying to reinstitute a liberal order. And they saw that in order to do that, they also needed to embed and inculcate a particular set of morals that sanctioned inequality, wealth accumulation, individual responsibility, personal and familial responsibility. So there was a very clear sense that if they were going to revive a competitive market order, then what they needed was to have a sort of a moral order that underpinned it. So in that sense, they weren't just interested in free trade. And in fact, quite explicitly, one of the reasons that this foundation was founded was to try to break with previous ideas of laissez-faire as being the central tenet of liberalism, and to argue for what they talked about as an interventionist liberalism, one that would actually use state power in order to shape a legal regime and also a moral framework that would support competitive market relations.
Wow. Can you give us a bit of a backstory about Hayek? Like, who was this person?
Yeah, okay, interesting. He's a fascinating figure. He was an Austrian economist. So he grew up in Austria. He participated in a sort of famous seminar run by another neoliberal economist, Ludwig von Mises, who's currently finding quite a bit of favour on the sort of alt-right. But Hayek was part of this circle in Austria, but he spent a lot of his career at the London School of Economics and later at Chicago. And he was really central to a sort of shift, I guess, from, in his early days, reasonably narrow economic questions. He and his mentor, Ludwig von Mises, were really important protagonists in what was called the socialist calculation debate of the 20s and the 30s, which was about the possibility of economic planning and whether it was possible to have a socialist planned economy. And Hayek and von Mises argued very strongly that any society without a price mechanism would end in inefficiency and ultimately in totalitarianism. So one of the really important things about Hayek in particular is that he really made this transition from narrow economic questions to broader political questions and questions about law and social order. So his late books have titles like The Constitution of Liberty and Law, Legislation and Liberty. So they were no longer just narrow economics textbooks. But one of his most famous texts, probably the one he's still most famous for, was called The Road to Serfdom. And this came out just after the Second World War. And it was essentially an argument that people in Western societies, particularly in the UK and in the US, were risking this path to serfdom, that they were following this path that had been followed by the so-called totalitarian societies of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, because they were allowing the state to intervene into the economy in the form of welfare provision, in the form of various forms of planning. So The Road to Serfdom was a really polemical book against any form of economic planning, but also against forms of welfare. And it was very popular. It was republished in the Reader's Digest in a serialized form, for instance. So this kind of gave these ideas a real prominence. And it also gave Hayek a real prominence. He was always a bit uncomfortable about the fact that this had been his most important book in a sense, because it was really a sort of a quite well-written polemical propaganda tract in some ways, but it was really central to the development of neoliberalism as we understand it today.
And how does neoliberalism affect us today, especially here in Australia?
Yes, well, gosh, where to start? I mean, I'm working in a university. So in the university sector, it's meant a whole lot of things around the attempt to instill competition in every aspect of life. And I think that this is something that was very explicit for the early neoliberals. They said, we need to get away from this idea of a sort of laissez-faire order where the state just leaves the market alone. And we need to think instead about how can the state actually actively encourage competition in every sphere. The way that universities, for instance, are now increasingly individualized and competitive. So rather than, for instance, research funding simply going to a university to be equally distributed between faculty, it's largely won on the basis of competitive grants. This is a really minor example, and there are much more severe examples across other sectors of the influence of neoliberalism in this country. But certainly if you look at welfare policy, for instance, and this is something that we've seen interesting shifts around in the context of COVID, but the central ideas of many of these neoliberal thinkers were about the idea that the state needed to instill personal responsibility and also family responsibility. So all the kind of measures that you see in the form of mutual obligation and things that aim to make the receipt of welfare quite a punitive process and quite a difficult process for people are very much in line with much neoliberal thinking, which was essentially about depriving people of non-market forms of reproduction so that people were forced to engage in market relations on whatever terms the market was offering, essentially.
One of the aspects of the neoliberal belief system that I find very hard to understand is this idea that the market is a great equalizer and it will solve everything. And I'm just wondering if you can talk us through that. The belief that the market is, will solve all problems.
Yes, sure. So yes, I mean, this profound faith in the market is something which is really central to neoliberalism. But it's also something quite ambiguous because they don't believe that this market is simply a natural order. They believe that it requires various forms of state intervention and law in order to make it work properly. But the important point is that the forms of state intervention that they support are never forms that are about restraining the market. They're never about regulating actual market exchange in ways that temper the inequalities of the market, for instance. They're always about sort of setting the market to work, making the market as competitive as possible. So in Hayek's case, he uses this term, the spontaneous order, and he talks about a market order as a spontaneous order. But he also says that this market order is essentially unknowable. It's impossible to know the overall economic framework, and therefore we can't really ever say that the market is the most effective way of coordinating a society, and yet we kind of can. So there's always this sort of interesting tension where on the one hand the market is unknowable, can't be known in its entirety, which means the implication of that is that it can't be planned or it can't be adequately intervened into. You just have to sort of let it go. But on the other hand, there's this faith that when you do that, you will ultimately get the best options. And Hayek ties himself in a lot of sort of knots trying to make both of these things true at the same time. So he says, look, I admit that faced with depressions or with huge economic recession or mass unemployment, where, in his words, not all will hit it off so perfectly, that some people may not be convinced that the market order will simply right things in the end, but that we have to have faith. So faith actually plays a really important role in his account of the market and in neoliberal thought more generally. You have to have faith in this ultimately unknowable market order. And Hayek talks about how one of the great dangers of rationalism, as he sees it, is that people start refusing to submit to that which they can't understand. And so he really wants to counsel forms of submission, and he uses this term submission really explicitly. We need to submit to the market order despite the fact that we're unable to actually know it or understand it. And we just, in a sense, have to take his word for it, that submitting to this order ultimately will produce the best of all possible worlds.
Sounds like religion.
Well, precisely. And I mean, Hayek is really interesting in this account because he was personally agnostic, but he said that he believed that society probably needed religion because it was only religion that convinced us to submit to that which we don't understand. So he said, you know, people used to submit because of superstitions or religious beliefs. And okay, I don't believe those, but that's preferable to a state in which people are rationalists and they refuse to submit unless they understand. So you're absolutely right. It's a sort of a formally religious argument, even if at the level of the content, Hayek is asking us to submit to an unknowable market order, not an unknowable divine order.
And so how have these beliefs spread from 1947 to now, to here in Australia, for example?
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question. And it's a question that I was trying to understand, particularly in relation to human rights, because one of the things that really struck me is how much of the discourse of contemporary human rights NGOs draws on a whole bunch of themes that neoliberal thinkers had been developing for decades. And particularly these were themes which tended to view civil society or market society as a realm of freedom and mutually beneficial relations and distributed private power, and to view the state and politics as the source of violence and repression. And so there was a really interesting sort of parallel there. And I wanted to know if there was more than simply a sort of coincidence. And in various ways, I mean, these neoliberal thinkers were very good at conceptualizing themselves as having a pedagogical function in society. Many of them were very involved in various administrations of neoliberal politicians. Say, you know, Margaret Thatcher, for instance, corresponded extensively with Hayek. And there's a legendary story about her, perhaps apocryphal, but going into a Conservative Party meeting, and when she was frustrated at some of her colleagues not towing the line, she apparently pulled a copy of Hayek's Constitution of Liberty out of her handbag, threw it down on the table and said, "This is what we believe." So on the one hand, they actually had this genuine influence on people like that. Many of the Chicago School neoliberals were very influential in the Reagan administration, but they also had lots of involvement in think tanks and in various forms of pedagogy, often very well funded by corporate interests. And then the cases that are, in a sense, more tenuous and so more of interest to me was, for instance, I looked at the case of Médecins Sans Frontières, the established humanitarian organisation. And in the 1980s, they set up a foundation called Liberté Sans Frontières. And they were, in doing so, aiming to combat anti-colonial ideas of income redistribution to compensate for colonialism. And they Médecins Sans Frontières drew directly on the thought of prominent neoliberal thinkers. So they invited the neoliberal development theorist Lord Peter Bauer, who was a member of Hayek's Mont Pelerin Society, to attend their first major conference on challenging third worldism. So there were some quite explicit links whereby the ideas of these neoliberals that had once been sort of developed as part of reasonably small, more right-wing circles began to become a sort of progressive common sense. And it's that I'm interested in, the fact that many of the people today who subscribe to ideas that were articulated from the 30s and 40s by neoliberal thinkers would not think of themselves as neoliberals, would not know where these ideas came from, would not conceptualize themselves as on the right of politics. So it's been that process of dissemination that I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, well, I was about to say, how is it that almost, so few of us understand this word? And as I said, earlier, we always associate it more with kind of radical politics or on the left, rather than understanding it as actually a system that has highly infiltrated our system. So why is it that we know so little?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things. One is that early on, many of these thinkers I'm talking about use the term neoliberal to talk about themselves. So there's, for instance, a paper from 1951 by Milton Friedman, the Chicago School economist, who was then very young and a member of the Mont Pelerin Society, which had only been founded a few years earlier. And it's called Neoliberalism and Its Prospects. And he talks about us as neoliberals and what we're aiming to achieve, which on his telling was largely to uphold the liberal order, but to replace the idea of laissez-faire with the idea of competition. So that was a really explicit period in which they were talking about themselves as neoliberals, but they tended to move away from using that language themselves. And then I think that today, people who use the term neoliberal use it in a whole lot of different ways. I think very recently, there's been a lot of really great scholarship on neoliberalism that has tried to do more of the historical work in tracing the development of this set of ideas and where they came from. But I think that there's a lot of previous work which has sort of had a tendency to just use neoliberalism as a bit of a political swear word for everything that we don't like if you're on the left. And then people who are on the right generally just disavow the label altogether. It doesn't make sense. There's no such thing. And so it makes it quite difficult to pin down. And then because there were numerous different currents within the neoliberal movement, I would see it as a broader movement rather than a single defined ideology. So there were differences amongst these thinkers, and some of the, say, Chicago School economists took different and much more strictly economic positions than some of, say, the German neoliberals, who were much more concerned with themes of morality and social conservatism. So there are diverse strands within it, which makes the task of definition difficult. And I think because of that difficulty of definition, there's a tendency for people to just hear the term and not really know what it means, and so dismiss it as being a useful term. I think it is a useful term, but I think that It's not so much a question of asking what exactly is neoliberalism, any more than asking what exactly is liberalism is necessarily going to be a useful question. There are different strands of liberalism. And I think that the same is true of neoliberalism. But I think that this idea fundamentally that they were interested in embedding competition at all levels of society, and that they saw market relations not as natural relations, but as relations that required state intervention and required laws to support competitive markets, and also required a conducive moral order, is quite important and was true across almost all branches of the neoliberal movement.
I'm just wondering, you know, how does a concept such as art fit into this kind of these ways of thinking? Because I mean, I know that, you know, the idea of government has a very specific role in neoliberalism. So what does art, what's art's role?
Wow, yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I hope that all of you will have more answers to it. The neoliberal thinkers themselves, to the best of my knowledge, the major ones didn't tend to answer that question or discuss it in detail. I mean, we could answer it at one level, at the level of arts funding and the way it's been reorganized and the competitive dynamics that are everywhere across the art world. And that could be one sort of institutional economic answer. But then there would be really interesting questions about actually the role of art beyond the funding of art, but what artists actually do and how this fits into either supporting or challenging neoliberalism. And I don't think that I have adequate answers to that, but I would be really interested to hear what artists think about that question and how people see their own practice. Obviously, there are artists that explicitly attempt to position their work as some kind of challenge to neoliberalism. There are artists that try to conceptualize how you represent the abstractions of something like an extended market order. But there are numerous different ways that you could think about what it would mean to produce art that would be, if not explicitly in opposition to neoliberalism, at least attempting not to be subsumed by it or attempting to make it in some ways visible. So yeah, maybe that's a question for all of you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jessica. I've just got one last question. What do you think we can do to live in a more, I suppose, sustainable and healthy way with neoliberalism in our lives?
Well, look, I think that in a way, this fact that, say, for Hayek and for many of them, this whole order is so reliant on faith, gives me a certain amount of hope, because what Hayek and others were terrified by was the idea that if we weren't prepared to submit, if we really started to question this order, then it would not function as he intended it to do, that it really relied on a kind of blind faith. It relied on people believing that, in Margaret Thatcher's words, there is no alternative. So it seems to me that while neoliberalism, I think, is still very powerful and still shapes our lives, I feel that some of the utopia that was associated with it has very much worn thin. I see my students today, and very few of them, I think, believe that they're going to have a richer, freer, better life than the generation of their parents. They're extremely worried about their economic futures and as well as the broader future of the planet, for instance. And so it seems to me that that willingness to simply submit and to believe that the market order is, you know, that there is no alternative, that this is the best of all possible worlds, is weakening. And so I think that on the one hand, we need to continue to question that notion. And on the other hand, and this is the difficult thing, there's the question of thinking about alternatives, of how we would organise life and production and reproduction outside of the framework of neoliberalism. And I think there are lots of little interesting attempts to do that happening, some bigger attempts, but I think that that's the real challenge today.
Thank you so much for your time today, Jessica. That was wonderful. Thanks.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Fabulous.
Great.
Well done, Görkem. I mean, I would really like to start. We're going to spend the next 10 minutes or so just having a chat amongst us in response to that. And I'd like to start by asking you, because you are an academic in the arts as well, that whole section where she started to kind of reveal the machinery of how universities have become, you know, co-opted really by this way of thinking. And I'm just interested in whether you've seen that in the work that you have been doing.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked sessionally. I've never been a full-time academic, but I've worked sessionally at universities for maybe on and off for about 10 years. And I think anyone who's done sessional work at a university, especially if you're an artist doing that, you know about this, all of the things that Jessica was talking about. So the competition, and the absolute economizing of your time. And while, of course, you do get paid really well to do the actual hours, the amount of time and the amount of work that you have to do outside of that, you know, the crumbs that you're given, how you feel that this idea of competition really plays into, you know, the scarcity of those positions and the amount of people that want to do it. So it does feel like there's this, you know, extreme amount of competition. And I guess I was thinking about it as she was talking, that, you know, I think it's the same in the arts with artists. Like this, you know, we're all fighting for, you know, from an artist perspective, we're all fighting for funding. We have to, you know, we're pitted against each other. It's, you know, the absolute kind of, the artists are sort of at the bottom of the rung of the arts. And that, you know, the market of artists working against each other, it's kind of like this idea of the spontaneous order that Jessica was talking about, the idea that we're all going to fight it out amongst ourselves. We'll, you know, clamber for the crumbs that we're given. And the best artists are going to rise to the top. You know, this is the idea that the market will solve everything, that the artist market, you know, the way that we're structured, the sector is structured, will always, the best will come to the top. It will solve everything. And I just was thinking about that as she was talking.
Yeah, I completely agree about the challenge of that. And I suppose the way I reflect on it is that over my career, really, I've seen, you know, it started when I was a child. So the professionalisation of the arts, though, is still relatively young in Australia. So my mother was involved in the 70s in the setting up of the Australian Film and Television School. And that was sort of as part of a whole tranche of organisations that were established between the 50s and the 70s to start professionalising. And, you know, NIDA, I think, started in the 50s, and then VCA came in the 70s, and WAPA came at 1980, I think. So that's the beginning. And then in the 1970s, as that was happening, the focus on education in the wider culture was very strong. But it very quickly then started to follow big business and business modelling. So in the 80s, it was marketing, and everybody started to kind of get on board with publicity and marketing. And then in the 90s, it was fundraising. People got development officers and so on. And in the noughties, it was producing and curating, which then really solidified artists not having access to the people who are employing them. These are huge generalizations, so I want to make a real disclaimer about that. But I suppose I can see that. And of course, in that process, I've seen artists move further down the food chain, as it were. So that for me is a huge alarm bell about what it is that we're then now currently dealing with, as we've seen an ideology in the current government to withdraw funding, and that scrabbling for money that you're talking about, Görkem, has just got so much more intense. So that's that's kind of how I think about it. And I guess I'm interested in where, you know, in the faith conversation, where is the room for the intangibles that are much more scary, that obviously these neoliberals were trying to trying to find solutions for or answers to. And actually, of course, what the arts do is create space so that we can dive into those places and find new answers and find, you know, and find the space to feel and all the things that aren't covered by market forces at all.
We'd love to open up the conversation for anyone who has any thoughts about this topic. Like, you know, Jessica really unpacked some key points for us there, and it'd be really great to hear how you see those relating to the arts. Does anyone have anything they'd want to add? Just turn your mic on and contribute, or you can put it in the chat and we can read it out. The other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking then, Pippa, and related again, I suppose, to the university sector, but also absolutely to the arts, is that you know, in the universities, the massive amounts of administration, so many people that are, you know, have these full-time roles of administrating who knows what, when really at the end of the day, teaching and education is not that complicated. You know, you don't really need that many people. And I think we see exactly the same thing in the arts. Like all of our arts organizations, there's, you know, the amount of people that are administrating, and you know, we've really seen that through the COVID situation where, you know, all these people that are administrating have these wonderful full-time jobs, and you know, working from home. And the artists, again, as I said earlier, the artists at the bottom of the food chain aren't, you know, able to sort of have that same luxury. Does anyone have any comments? Can I call on you? Alex, I'm so sorry, Alex Harrison, I didn't get to talk to you earlier. I didn't come back to you. Did you have any thoughts you wanted to add? Totally fine if not. I'll take that as a not. Oh, no, sorry.
Oh, look, there's so many things, but one of them in relation to the, it's about, I guess it's about orientation. So we're so used to our orientation being in a particular direction. And I guess that things as they are and what seems, the way things are done and what seems reasonable, such as the kind of writing to a bunch of criteria that are set out for artists to meet, rather than the possibility of us saying, oh, well, what do we need? We'd like to answer this kind of question and we'd like to talk about our art in these terms. And even if it's something so small as to say, you know, I don't want to talk about marketing, but I'm really happy to talk about the way my work relates to people. You know, and it's just a slightly different focus, but it comes to be in terms that, you know, that we can be decided, you know, and that aren't prescribed, and they don't set a particular tone. This is the way, yeah, these are the terms in which we all must operate. And yeah, so I feel like there's possibilities there, you know, and, you know, I'm sure that Ozco would love to chat with me about it.
Israel, I know you've had thoughts and conversations about this kind of alternative funding models. Did you want to add anything?
I don't know. I'm thinking about a few different things. I'm just thinking about how it's in a way, maybe it was an inevitable development of the chain of humanism into the Enlightenment, into liberalism, into neoliberalism. It's kind of, in a way, it is the arrival of a new religion. And I think that it has to do with the trend settings, that this is something that maybe we as the artists can, it's a little bit like what Alex said now, we can maybe resist the trends. Because I think that if we think that the market knows best, it kind of, it sets up a reality where artists just need to serve the market. And what happens is that there's no real liberty. There's no actual freedom in proposing either content or even aesthetic, even form, that we as the artists, as the rebels in a way, we are the ones that are supposed to go against the stream and swim, you know, in the opposite direction. So I don't know, in different conversations, there was the concept of solitude, isolation, alienation from society that artists kind of find themselves struggling with. And I think that maybe there's something about the unavoidable connection between education and arts. And I think that the way that people are being introduced to what an artist is in the very early days of their experience with art. And as we know, you spoke a lot about how a lot of artists are going to university thinking that the university will make them an artist. And that also kind of means that the universities hold in their hands the power of deciding who is an artist, which it kind of needs to be the other way around. The education organizations and institutions need to be a place where people who are already artists come to gain more skills and tools to basically refine their own voice. And that's not really what's happening. So it kind of, I think, needs to both zoom deeper into who we are as artists and how we maybe getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, and move within the chaos and move beyond the chaos. But at the same time, also maybe understand that the responsibility lies on other sectors in society, and how we as artists can also go into these other sectors and see what we can do in other ways to influence our, in a way, percentage of the overall ecology of society.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, Israel. And I just want to pick up on 2 points there. One is that continuum that you described, which is, you know, from the Renaissance on, of course, isn't the reality in Australia because of invasion. And so it's important just to notice that, because so much has been imported and imposed here. What that does mean is that it's got very shallow roots. So there's, when I think I can think of other examples of when things seem completely impossible to change, and actually then they change very quickly, because we often, we do a lot of trend following in this country. The other thing that I'd like to pick up on is that point about education. Obviously, there are alternative forms of education, like Rudolf Steiner, for example, that puts creativity and artistic expression at the very foundation of a child's kind of entering into a system that is then going to turn it into a socialized being. But our formal education system doesn't work like that at all, and we've lost the alternative. And then the last point is that I'm the granddaughter of an artist who always knew that her role was to sit on the outside of the system. And I think there's something really, really interesting about then noticing how people enter thinking that they're entering an industry. And it's so different from what I think happened before this professionalisation process, which is kind of why I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So I guess there is a real challenge about where the arts, the sort of commercial arts and entertainment business absolutely leans into the establishment, and then what the role of other arts is to question and challenge and be the resistor. And I think that's an, you know, I don't want to put that into polarized position, but I think that's an interesting bit of conversation. Can I, I'm just noticing, sorry, Görkem.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Vivian's made a comment. Did you want me to read it out? Or Vivian, did you want to speak to your comment?
Sure, I can indeed. Yeah, look, over here in WA, where I am, we are consumed by funding from mining and fossil fuel industries when it comes to the arts. And we've started to try to put on a movement over here to question that kind of funding. But what we're finding is that while there's a lot of artists individually and personally supportive of it, they cannot see a way forward to resist it because they fear loss of income, they fear rejection, they fear being sidelined. And as much as it's laudable to have this idea of being an outsider, of being a rebel, to do that, one also then needs to have an independent income of your arts practice to be able to keep going. And so in terms of that neoliberal thing, we've been captured by that economic model, which makes us, pulls us into that kind of almost feudal system of being part of the industry. And we are reliant on the gatekeepers to open up the door for us, to give us the money and to use us as compliant artists, really. And You know, I try to fight this. I'm an older person. I'm more financially secure than a lot of young artists, so I feel I've got this privilege too. But it is a very tricky, delicate way to resist the system, I suppose is what I'm saying.
Thanks, Vivian.
Thanks, Vivian. I mean, a total respect to that. And I would say that a lot of the artists are already not earning a living. You know, there's also a kind of mythology around what is possible within this system. But the mythology, a bit like neoliberalism, seems to, you know, well, it's aligned to neoliberalism. It keeps people co-opted. And there's something kind of interesting about that. So what we thought we would do now is to go into a couple of breakout rooms and do a bit of brainstorming. And I've put the mural board that I've prepared for this session in the chat. If people feel comfortable going there, by all means. If you don't, it's not necessary. What we thought would be great to talk about is ideas about what we can do. We are really focused on action. They can be practical and impractical. I'm all for big crazy ideas. And we thought it would be useful to frame it in two ways. One, what you can do personally, and, you know, as small or as big as you like. And then what could we do? What could you do with others? And I think maybe it would be useful. I'll just give you a couple of examples that I've come up with. I tend to go to the what can we do and then try and distill it down to the personal, just my taste. I think the universal basic income is a really great start and a really great campaign to get on board with. I've been a fan for a while that arts agencies should absolutely insist that money goes to artists. What would it look like if the Australia Council was funding artists first and the organisation was growing around that? It would totally transform our system. And then embracing community practice, which is one of the things that came up last week. And I think, again, there's some really interesting interventions that could make into our system. Anyway, that's just a few thoughts that I'd had, but we're really keen to hear your thoughts. So Elliot's going to put us into breakout groups. I suggest that if one person in each group wants to just hold the group, that would be great. And maybe just somebody else to take a few notes and share it back with the wider group. And we'll do that for the next 20 minutes. Welcome back. I'm just wondering if people would like to share the kind of headlines of what their conversation was about.
Pippa, contrary to what we discussed earlier, I ended up being the note taker. So I've got some notes. Do you want me to read them out or share them, or can someone else from the group want to share them? I think they wanted me to read them. But do you want me to do that?
They're nodding.
Yeah, great. So yeah, people had great points. George brought up this really great point, which is a kind of question. First of all, he said we should think about space and the commodification of space and the high values that are put on physical space. And if we were to go to a universal basic income, what would that actually do to the, you know, already space is so hard to come by for artists and for art. What would a universal basic income do to that? Would it actually increase the lack of space? Bron had this really great thought about maybe artists infiltrating corporations and law firms and, you know, accounting firms, rather than those people coming onto arts boards. Maybe artists could go and infiltrate those organizations. She also made the great point that people have in the arts, you know, we are used to things falling down and falling apart. And so through the COVID times, it hasn't been a big shock for a lot of us to work out how to make things work. And these are skills that a lot of other areas don't have. So, you know, maybe there's a way to kind of, yeah, to make everything a bit more imaginative and creative through that. We also had, and actually Bron mentioned an amazing project by Tanya Bruguera, where people are raising money to liberate people from their debt, and it's an artwork. So she was interested in art that's not marketable.
It's not her work, but she mentioned it in a talk.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. It's just, yeah, not hers. But I'll put the link to the org in the chat.
Thanks, Brian. And Deb said that just exposing that neoliberalism is an unknowable thing that we have faith in, the exposure in itself is really interesting. How do we expose that is a kind of action. And also there was some points about how to, as artists, what to give freely. So what can we give freely? There's there's so much, rather than having this hierarchy, this idea of hierarchy that was spoken about last time, and art as being special and kind of separated. What is it that artists can give and see everyone's right to participate? So there were a few of the points. Yes, not everything, but most.
Beautiful. I did the same. People happy for me to share some of those notes? Thanks. It was to relieve you of the burden of taking notes, but obviously they have to listen to me talk again. I guess we talked a bit about activism. Somebody mentioned Theatre Network Australia's got this new campaign to try and get, it's quite an old school campaign to go and talk to your local MP and get more empowered in the political space. And then there was a bit more conversation about activism. How do you join with others? What movements are out there? And that would be the bigger question that I would ask. What bigger movements are already happening that artists can join? And is there mileage, or will it help to embed art into some of these other movements? I would say absolutely yes. Learning from social media, there was a bit of a conversation about the impact and connection to young people, and how to use the tools that exist and where information comes from, and how to engage more young people in this conversation. Marissa brought that in. And then there was also, sorry, I'm just looking on the mural board where I put it. No, sorry. Did this last week as well, I seem to remember. Not very good at taking the notes and then getting them back to myself. I'm also, I also just wanted to pick up on the point that was made in your group, Görkem, about public space. And this, I worked at Barangaroo in Sydney. I don't know if people know, it's on Darling Harbour, huge multi-billion-dollar development, and I was there sort of coming up with arts projects for their corporate sector, which was 6 months of my life. But what was really interesting was I finally understood that actually this neoliberalism was completely across the board, and that I was working for the state government who talked all the language of the market, that the kind of major arts organisations that were engaging were talking the language of the market. The corporates were talking the language of the arts. So a very interesting kind of, what does that look and feel like, and how then do we encourage our public institutions to talk about public good again, and civil society, and some of the other values that they're supposed to represent, when actually they're so co-opted by neoliberal language that they have forgotten that that's what they do. So back to the space question, I'm interested in whether we could make arts organisations that are run by councils into some kind of creative commons, so that they become free completely of market value. That to me aligns with an Indigenous kind of cultural lens, and it aligns with place. You know, you could wrap it all up into one nice connected ecosystem.
Yeah, great point. Yeah.
Can I add something quickly, if that's all right? Yeah, what you're saying to me, that there's the new economics of well-being, and including well-being as a measure of economic success as opposed to gross domestic product. And that kind of well-being approach is where I think the arts sits really well, because of the social well-being, the cultural well-being, the cultural identities, all of these things that can be caught into that. I know that New Zealand is looking at a wellbeing budget with the Labour Greens coalition over there in the government, and there's a whole raft of indicators that is part of that. So it's a different approach from that very rigid dollar value that the GDP only recognises. And it's interesting when you talk about corporations talking in the language of arts, because corporations understand very much that it's emotions that sell. And that's why there's a lot of corporate greenwashing, corporate art washing going on, where they put their names next to the social causes that they recognise as being useful to them, because they understand that emotional connection. And we as artists must understand, we understand it very well, but obviously our administrators just look at the budget. So I just thought I'd pop that there. Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful. We're at the time boundary. Görkem's had to go because she has another meeting. So I would like to close this session to say that the mural board will stay open. So if you have an idea at 4 o'clock in the morning, which is often when I have my ideas, feel free to go in and pop it in there. We will return to this. This is sort of the way we've structured these sessions. So we'll return to this conversation a little bit at the beginning of the next session, and we'll link that very neatly into the climate emergency. We've got Deb Hart, who some of you may know. She leads the Climax and the Climate Guardians, but she's done an incredible amount of work looking at corporations and looking at how arts organisations are kind of co-opted by fossil fuel industry. So that'll be quite interesting. And then we've got Dr. Kim Liu, who is a general practitioner in Sydney, who will talk about the effects of climate change on the body, which is, I hope will be interesting for all of us. So thank you so much for joining. Really great to have these conversations, and look forward to seeing you again.